All right, there is one last mic I want to talk about before we move on, and that is a podcast mic. So first, let's talk about why you might even want to use a podcast mic. So if you're going to be talking in one spot, like at a table, and you're going to be there all the time, and you want to get that rich radio sound, but you don't have a perfect recording studio environment around you, then a podcast mic is probably going to be your best bet for making your voice sound good. Unlike shotgun mics that can record sounds that are a foot or two away from them, podcast mics are meant to be used with the sound source only 2 or 3 inches away from them. And so that means they're much less sensitive to noises that are farther away and in the background. And so they're not going to pick them up as much as a shotgun mic. And that means your voice is going to be the star and you're going to have this beautiful broadcast sound. You're listening to National Public Radio with your host, Mary Betsy. Now, the downside to podcast mics is because they do need to be so close to your mouth to get that good sound, that means you're going to see them in your shot. And so if you're cool with the mic being seen in your video, or if you're just going to be recording voiceovers and no video, then a podcast mic could be a great option for you. If you're interested in buying a podcast mic, the first thing you need to know is that there are 2 kinds of podcast mics. So there are XLR podcast mics and there are USB podcast mics. So let me tell you a little about both of these options. Let's start with XLR podcast mics. So XLR podcast mics have a better sound quality than USB podcast mics. In my opinion, I have tested both of them, and after reading a bunch of blogs from audio experts, I have learned that I am not crazy because they agree with me, and so it should not be surprising then that XLR podcast mics tend to be pricier than USB podcast mics. Not just the mics themselves, but the fact that to use an XLR podcast mic, you're going to need an external audio recorder that has an XLR port like one of these. Unless your camera has XLR inputs built into it, but most popular consumer cameras do not have these. And so that means you need this external audio recorder. And that also means that if you're recording audio with an XLR podcast mic and you're shooting video at the same time, you're going to need to sync that audio before you start editing. Now, if you just want to record a beautiful sounding voiceover and you want to sit at your computer while you're doing that, then again, your computer is also not going to have an XLR port, but you can still record audio straight into your computer, again, by using an external audio recorder. So you're going to connect the recorder to your mic with an XLR cable, and then you're going to connect the recorder to your computer with a USB cable. Then you'll need to check the user manual for your audio recorder to know which settings to pick from there, but this setup does make it possible to record right into your computer with an XLR podcast mic instead of waiting for all those files to transfer from an SD card, which can take forever. Anyway, overall, to recap about XLR podcast mics, they sound better than USB podcast mics, but they tend to be more expensive and a little more complicated to use. USB podcast mics, on the other hand, they might not sound quite as nice as XLR podcast mics, but they do tend to be cheaper and simpler to use. You don't need an external audio recording device to interface between a USB mic and your computer. You can just plug your USB mic straight into your computer's USB port. The other advantage is you can connect a USB podcast mic into your camera so that the audio from the mic gets recorded onto your camera's video files and you don't need to sync in post. But the setup for that is a little more complicated. You're going to need a couple cables, you're going to need to adjust your camera settings, and you also need to connect a phone or a computer in the mix, but you won't need to sync audio, which is really convenient. So overall, USB podcast mics might not sound quite as good as XLR ones, but they tend to be cheaper and they can help you avoid syncing audio. So that's a quick comparison of XLR versus USB podcast mics, and I've got both types of these mics listed in the audio guide, and each one is only $99, so you can't go wrong either way. And I've also got an articulating arm for podcast mics that attaches to your desk, and this, let me tell you, this has made my life so convenient. It is one of the best purchases I have ever made. All right, y'all, that's it for podcast mics. And next up, we're going to be talking about why wind blows. Get it? I get so proud of myself for these puns. All right, I will see you there.